Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I've already done a lockdown live stream this morning. So for some of you, for the second time, good morning and welcome to our not an elephant professional lecture this time, but a professional lecture, a very, very professional lecture, and not entirely irrelevant. Normally at this time of year for the last maybe 10,000 years, our grassland in front of where the elephants currently are would be under 3 or 4 feet of water. Possibly more, and it would be fluctuating, and it would be a lovely place for, it would be about 2 or 3 square kilometers for ducks to breed, fish to breed, for all sorts of things to go on with cover and safety from predators. And there would be the elephant dung would be flushed out, new nutrients would come in, and our grassland, in short, is designed to flood, as is grassland up and down this large river that we call the Mekong. The Mekong, the flooding would be on the back of the Mekong, which is designed, which would come very high and would then go down, and obviously during the low season be much, the dry season be much lower. About 5 or 6 years ago, this stopped happening. It'd been here for about 15 years at the time, and it had happened every year, and we expected a flood, and we had planned for a flood, and we knew we would lose our grassland every year for 2 or 3 months, but we enjoyed the fact that it was then turned over to nature. And about 5 or 6 years ago, this stopped happening, and we didn't know why. Luckily, there was a book out called The Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, so we could read a bit about how things were changing on the Mekong. We could learn and get some inkling about it. And then that was written by our professional lecturer today, Brian Eyler. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, actually. Yep. Okay, good. That was written by our professional lecturer, who has since gone on to become, I think in the book you say you're obsessed by the Mekong. You are now, I would say, extremely obsessed by the Mekong, and has, at the Stimson Center, where he works in the States, has come up with all sorts of bits of technology to be able to monitor exactly what's going on and what the cause of many things that happen to the Mekong are, including our lack of flooding. And without rambling on too much further, I will hand you over to Brian, and he will tell you all about what he does. And unfortunately, his talk is entitled "The Mekong at Crisis Point," and that probably tells you where we are today. So, Brian, over to you. Thank you for joining. Sorry for the scrambled introduction, and please do tell us all about the crisis in the Mekong and hopefully what we can do to avert it somehow. Right, we can't hear you without your microphone. I think you need your headphones.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, great. So we do need the headphones. I figure I was better looking without them. But, John, you and I have known each other for about 2 years now. The first meeting at Mekong Pizza there, when I gave a book talk for Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, and we made fast friends, but I guess we never really went over how to pronounce our last names. My last name is Eyler, so pronounced like the I.
Mine is Roberts.
Really? Okay, thank you. And I've learned so much from you and your work on the wetlands there by the hotel and Sub Rock, and elephants and elephant habitat restoration, and just so much that we've developed an interesting simpatico, particularly since the launch of the Mekong Dam Monitor. And I'm going to show the viewers a little bit of that simpatico here in a bit. But it's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Eyler. As John mentioned, I'm the author of a book called Last Days of the Mighty Mekong. And the talk that I'm giving is an update because this book came out in February 2019, which meant that it was really finished in July 2018. And a lot has happened since then. A lot of the risks that are predicted and the impacts that are predicted in this book, and done so by many, many others, are now playing out. So much so that the Mekong is at, many fears its ecological tipping point, are already past its point of no return. So just the example of John's, the wetlands there on the Rock River by the Mekong is one example of a point of no return. But then the question is are we really there? Can things be restored? And can the mightiness of the Mekong be saved? That's the question we're going to explore tonight. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes on with a lecture called the Mighty Mekong at Crisis Point. And I'm going to share my screen here. And afterwards, we're going to take some questions. I'll be happy to take your questions. Let me know if this, yes, I think this is showing the right screen. Whether it's from John or from those tuning in on Facebook, feel free to ask and we'll have a good conversation. So I'm the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Stimson Center, which is a nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, DC. And my team has for well over a decade looked at this Mekong problem and promoted sustainable forward-looking solutions out of the problem. I've been working with the team for about 6 years, previously living in China. Now, some of our work over the last year has been highlighted in international media and local media, particularly when we took up the mantle of promoting what's known as the Eyes on Earth study. The Eyes on Earth study was, for the first time, something that showed us definitively how much water China's upstream dams were holding back, for how long and to what degree, with particular focus on a more current event, again, an update to this, how when during the wet season of 2019, when a historic drought was hitting the lower basin, the Eyes on Earth study showed that China's upstream dams, and we're going to take a deep dive into these dams here soon, held back more water than ever before, exacerbating that drought, when actually that water could have been used to relieve the drought and raise the level of the Mekong mainstream. So that work was highlighted in over 100 different media outlets. The New York Times broke the story. I landed the scoop with Hannah Beach, the reporter at the New York Times. And this really opened up a new day for the Mekong for transparency of not just the operations and impacts of dams in China, but also those in the downstream. So later on in 2020, my team launched the Mekong Dam Monitor, which is, as the headlines here say, we use satellites to track Chinese dams, not just China's dams, but also dams in Laos. And what we're doing is we're using satellites and social media updates to provide near real-time and accurate reporting to vulnerable communities and governments to reduce the risks from upstream dams. I'm going to go into what the monitor is doing here at the end of my talk. But before we do that, I want to show some of the attention that the efforts that my team has brought, and then the efforts of hundreds of others that are active in this Mekong space are bringing to new levels of attention, both at the local level in the Mekong region and international. I think John's efforts, and there are a couple other conservation organizations, many of them local, have really provided a lot of focus to the Golden Triangle, into the Sobrok, Changsen, Changkong area around Chiang Rai province, to how the river around them is changing. And particularly, this is important because this is the first kind of largely settled area downstream of China's mega dams that have impacts. And I really appreciate John's social media posting, which kind of ground truths the satellite data that we produce, where we're able to show that an upstream restriction is happening that's going to drop the level of the river, or an upstream release is happening and that's going to raise the level of the river. And often John will show how the elephants stand in the river as a result of those changes. That bottom left picture shows how the river level is high, and then just a few days later, the river level dropped. And this is just one of the examples of how social media is really improving the conversation and dealing with the misinformation problem about the river. So we have a lot of locals speaking right now about what's important to them, how fisheries are being depleted, how their local identities are changing, and how agricultural practices like riverbank agriculture during the dry season is changing because the river level is not low anymore. It's high during the dry season from upstream dam releases. So that's just an overview. Let's get down to the basics. Let's talk about the Mekong Basin. Right on this map, there is most of the Mekong Basin is shown. Actually, the river extends far up into the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, but I wanted to provide some focus on the downstream portion of the basin here to show that the Mekong Basin, and that's anywhere where water hits and eventually falls into the Mekong mainstream, where that's demonstrated by this gray area on this map. And you can see in China that the basin is rather tight. That's because there are many major rivers that come down through Yunnan province, very close to each other, and then move on to different parts of Yunnan and out into other parts of China or Myanmar on their way to the ocean. And then when the Mekong makes its way downstream, it really fans out and becomes and comprises major parts of the countries of mainland Southeast Asia. So most of the country of Laos is in the Mekong, half of the country of Thailand, actually a little bit more than half of the country of Thailand is in the Mekong when you bring in the Golden Triangle area there in Chiang Mai province and northeast Thailand as well. Nearly all of Cambodia is in the Mekong with the exception of coastal Cambodia. And then finally, the river empties out into the ocean, into the South China Sea in Vietnam and the Mekong Delta. And that patch of land there at the bottom of the map is about the size of the country of Denmark in area, but a lot more people live there. There are 20 million people that live in the Mekong Delta. And so the population density is actually the densest part of the Mekong Basin. And as we move back up the basin, population density decreases and the Mekong actually becomes more and more remote. There's a lot to say about this map, but I want to keep the talk going. One of the things that makes the Mekong mighty, and I think its most impressive superlative, is that it is the world's largest inland fishery for one single river. Just this river alone produces 20% of the world's freshwater fish catch. 2.6 million tons of fish come out of the river each year. Compare that to where I live in North America. I'm talking about a continent. All of our rivers and lakes combined in Canada, Mexico, and the US produce 160,000 tons of fish. Now, maybe that's because we've dammed all of our rivers. Maybe that's because we don't, rely on our rivers for fisheries. There are probably a lot of reasons for that. But in the Mekong, local fish catches are really important. They feed the people of the Mekong. So in Cambodia alone, 70% of Cambodia's protein intake, animal protein intake, comes from fish caught from the Mekong. And one of the things that delivers this amazing catch of fish per year from one single river system happens in Cambodia. It happens in the Tonle Sap Lake. So we're going to focus on the Tonle Sap Lake. That's that lake in the bottom portion of the map here in the middle of Cambodia. It's the largest lake in Southeast Asia. And every year, something really unique happens in this lake. So we have to take a step back and think about the climate of the Mekong. John talked about how now the wet season would be coming in and filling up the wetlands and the grasslands around the Anatar Hotel, creating, kind of a space for life and fish and things that rely on that wetland. Well, the same thing would be happening in Tonle Sap, only at a much greater scale. And that happens because the wet season rains begin to happen about this time of the year, and they work their way downstream. And when they get to Phnom Penh, the confluence of where that river that comes out of the Tonle Sap is and the Mekong mainstream, it raises the level of that Tonle Sap tributary and pushes water back up into the floodplain, basically causing the lake to expand to the size of the gray area, the dark gray area on this map. So the Tonle Sap Lake expands every year during the wet season, and it contracts during the dry season. This is the real miracle of the Mekong. It expands five times its area during the wet season, and 60 times the volume of water comes in through that expansion. You can see here some satellite images of the dry season, the wet season difference. And I think there's nothing better than these pictures that I took a few years ago, standing on the back of the same fisher's home, one in the dry season with a low river and a fishing village along the lake, another with about a 4-meter difference during the wet season. And life along the lake is entirely adjusted to this annual cycle. People's homes are 3 to 4 meters off the ground. During the dry season, folks get around by motorcycles and cars. During the wet season, it's only boats, and everybody fishes. So when the water comes in, so do fish, so does sediment, and a lot of other organic material that creates the conditions for this explosion of life. And that's where the world's largest inland fishery gets its start. When the contraction happens, those fish leave. They're looking to feed or they're looking to spawn upstream. And what is created is the Earth's largest migration. So it's bigger than the Serengeti migration in terms of biomass. It's just happening underwater. You can't see it so well. We're learning now how we can hear it. There are some audio techniques that are being put to use to hear this massive migration. But take my word for it, this is impressive. And it's been impressive for thousands of years. This expansion is something that happened about a few thousand years ago. And we can get into the geology if you're interested in a bit. But dams are changing all of this. So let's just take a quick look at dams and how dams are going to affect that hydrological expansion of the expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake. One of the biggest impacts that dams do is they change the natural flow of a river system. So in the Mekong, where a river is rising during the wet season in terms of volume and level, and then decreasing during the dry season because there's less water and less precipitation happening, the whole ecosystem is attuned to that natural rise and fall. And again, that's one of the things that creates this mightiness of the Mekong, the large fish catch that I talked about. Large dams, if they can store a lot of water, and if they're operated in a way that stores water in the wet season and releases water in the dry season, they can undo that natural flow. And certainly this is one of the things that's happening in the Mekong. So why would they do this? Well, it makes sense to release, if you're a dam operator producing hydroelectricity, it makes sense to release a lot of water in the dry season. Why is that? Well, electricity prices are high, and you can make a lot of money by selling power when electricity prices are high. And how do you get your fuel for producing electricity in the dry season? Well, you've got to save it during the wet season. And what better time than when it's raining, right, to collect water in a reservoir to wait for that dry season. And certainly this is what we've discovered is happening in China. And China's dams are powerful enough to entirely break that natural flow around the Anantara Hotel in the Golden Triangle. And then those effects kind of lessen downstream, but the effects are always felt downstream. Dams do other things, like they trap sediment behind the walls, and China's dams are trapping more than 60% of the Mekong sediment load. And the Mekong sediment load is important for fisheries because sediment is kind of the building block of plants that fish eat off of, and then also for agricultural production. So a flood process, and the Mekong is one that thrives on floods. When floods aren't happening, or if there's not as much sediment in those floods to deposit on the floodplains, then agricultural processes that rely on those, the annual flooding and the annual distribution of sediment, are going to be neutered. They're going to be really hit hard. And then finally, a third point that I want to make, first is the hydrological impacts, the natural flow changes, 2, sediment reduction and sediment trapping, and 3, fisheries impacts, fish migration. And the Mekong is known to have hundreds of long-distance migratory fish. More than 1,000 fish species have been identified already in the Mekong, making it one of the most biodiverse rivers in the world for for fish species, dams block the migratory paths. And you really can't build fish ladders good enough to have all these fish pass through it. So the migratory pathways of fish are really being kind of cut up and disconnected by dams. Now, what we haven't talked about is the extent of damming. I'm going to get there. But importantly, let's get back to the Tonle Sap. Let's think about dam impacts, but also some climate impacts. That there have been major droughts in the Mekong in 2016, 2019, and 2020. And some of these are the worst on record. 2019 and 2020, in fact, 2020 was worse than 2019, which makes a kind of a period of continuous drought in the Mekong over the last 2 years. So really, with the exception of mid-June of this year, when there was a good hard rain in the region, there really hasn't been a sustained rain period. There have been some storms, but the region's been mostly in drought conditions for the last couple of years. And climate change models indicate that the wet season is going to be shorter in the future, and that rainfall will become more intense. And we're starting to see this happening. So we want to think about how that's going to affect, say, the Tonle Sap expansion, right? So the rains are coming later and they're coming more intensely. You're going to get like a big push later on that will cause a quick expansion of the Tonle Sap, and then a quick contraction of the Tonle Sap. And what will that impact be on fisheries? But what we're seeing now is that in the data, and some of this is collected by the Mekong Dam Monitor, is that normally the expansion happens from June to December during the traditional wet season. But in 2019, the expansion was really short and very late. It happened from August to November. And then 2020, it happened even a shorter frequency period, from October to December. So it was much later and much shorter. And fishers in that part of Cambodia are saying that their catch is down more than 80% year on year. That means a big loss of income, big loss in protein. When you have millions of fishers that are reliant on this fish catch for both income and food, and those low catches repeat themselves year on year, it can only happen so long before something breaks, right? Before a food security crisis really unfolds in the region. And that's one of the things that I worry about. This is just a diagram that shows how droughts are on the increase in the basin. And it's from a report that we issued to promote how the US can more smartly engage in the Mekong, called Mekong Matters for America, America Matters for the Mekong. Going to the Mekong Delta, we're down in Vietnam on these maps, and what this part of the discussion and the lecture shows is both how dams and climate change impacts are working together to destroy the agricultural productivity, as well as the geological integrity of this really important landmass for Vietnam. So remember that that patch of land is the size of Denmark, and 20 million people live there. So the orange on the top left map shows salinity intrusion, which happens with sea level rise, right? So year on year, the ocean can penetrate more deeply in, but if tides get stronger on a daily basis, they're going to value cash crop, and transitioning to shrimp or fish or other higher value cash crops could generate more income if it weren't so risky and difficult transition to make. But even so, we're hearing that farmers that have transitioned to shrimp production are having trouble because the water is too salty. You have to have like fresh water and salt water available to make a mix for a good productive shrimp farm. And the water that's being held back, particularly during the wet season in China and other dams downstream, isn't getting fresh water into the delta during the wet season across those floodplains to recharge aquifers and provide a lot of fresh water. So this is causing actually what's happening on the right side of these maps. If you got less fresh water and you're a farmer and you need it, where do you get it? You pull it up from down below. And they're doing this at very intense rates. And when you're a farmer and you extract water from aquifers, especially in a way that's unregulated as it is in Vietnam, this causes the land to sink. So sea level rise plus land subsidence or land sinking from water extraction, they're working together to essentially destroy the delta. Now, why is the delta important? Well, the Mekong Delta produces half of Vietnam's rice export, 75% of Vietnam's fruit export, and 75% of its shrimp export. So here is upstream dams changing the regulatory pattern, holding back sediment that would be driving agricultural yields, but no longer is. And it's creating a lot of challenges for farmers in the Mekong Delta. And to make matters worse, all throughout the Mekong, people are extracting sand from the Mekong River. And when you extract sand from the Mekong River, and they're doing it to build buildings, they're using it for aggregate to build high rises across the river from the Anantara Hotel in the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone in Laos, or in Phnom Penh, where we see lots and lots of new high rises going up, or in Vietnam. When you remove sand and sediment from a river is going to look for more sand and sediment to kind of satisfy a natural appetite for a natural balance of sand and sediment in the river. And this is a phenomenon called hungry water. So when a river loses its sediment and looks for more, it's going to take it from kind of weak banks, river banks, and pull it away down into the river itself to satisfy that need. And what we've done here is just marked from 2018 to the present Google searches that we found in Vietnamese language of instances of riverbank collapse over the last 3 years. I think we have something like 28 tags here on that map. But prior to 2018, Vietnam's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development reported 562 eroded riverbank sites in the Mekong Delta, totaling 786 kilometers of riverbank loss. This is huge, and it's still happening. So you can scour the newspapers almost every day. You will see the instance of riverbank loss in the Mekong Delta, and that's from upstream extraction of sand and loss of sediment behind dams. So what are the dam problems, and what's the scale of dams that we're looking at here? Well, there's a lot of focus on the right side of the map on Mekong mainstream dams. And certainly there's no shortage of literature out there that show that the Mekong mainstream dams are a really bad idea for the mightiness of the Mekong, for the ecological integrity of the Mekong. And already 11 have been built in China. One is under construction. I need to update my map there. That uppermost white circle is actually under construction. And then 2 have been completed in Laos on the mainstream. But dams on tributaries can deliver the same level of impact as I discussed previously, to changing the natural flow of the Mekong, to stopping fish from migrating and trapping sediment. And if the Tonle Sap is to be preserved and this expansion is to be preserved for the betterment of the entire Mekong Basin, tributary dams that are located close to the Tonle Sap can be extremely impactful and damaging. And kind of a case in point is the Lower Sason 2 Dam, which is a green dam there near the A in Cambodia, which blocks 2 major tributaries of the Mekong, the Sason and the Srei Pak River. And if you can imagine that fish swing in and out of the Tonle Sap into those long tributaries that actually start in Vietnam, 2 of those tributaries are now blocked. What about numbers? These numbers are really staggering. And they're counted by my team on the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker database. And the dams that we're counting here in the top table are not just hydropower producing dams, but they're all dams that we found through looking at lists of dams published by countries, as well as using satellite imagery to find dams. So I'm really sorry to report that there are almost 400 dams operational in the Mekong Basin. There probably are more than that. We just haven't identified them. And interestingly, Thailand has built the most. Now they're not the largest, but they're the most, which kind of makes sense since half of Thailand is in the Mekong Basin. We're really looking at Isan, northeast Thailand here. Lots of irrigation dams and water supply dams and flood control dams and some hydropower dams. China, we hear a lot about China's 11 dams on the Mekong mainstream. What you don't hear a lot about is that there are 82 tributary dams as well, which can deliver impacts and restrict water and deliver local and impacts far away. But by and large, the future of damming the Mekong is in Laos and Cambodia. And Laos, with its plan to become the battery of Southeast Asia, wants to really max out its building of hydropower projects and fully exploit its numerous rivers, tributaries and all, to sell power to the neighborhood, to Vietnam and to Thailand and to Cambodia as well. And this project to be the battery of Southeast Asia has kind of hit the rocks a bit. The coronavirus is part of that. There's a lack of demand for electricity from Laos because of the renewable energy revolution that's happening in Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam. But still, the program is moving forward. So I really worry about the 286 more dams that are in the pipeline to complement 67 plus 47, 114 dams that are in Laos's definite future. One thing that I think is interesting is Cambodia. Cambodia has moved really slowly with building its dams. And Cambodia, from my discussions with government officials in Cambodia, many government officials understand the impacts that dams have on the Tonle Sap and the food security problem in Cambodia. So for this reason, damming has by and large slowed down. And last year, Cambodia postponed its two largest dams for the Mekong mainstream. That would be they're called killer dams. They're so large and they're so close to the Tonle Sap that they would entirely undo this mightiness of the Mekong. But the postponement was made for 10 years. And really, I think that was we're just going to kick the can down the road. And by the time 10 years come, there'll be lots of alternatives around here and we just can put those dams to bed once and for all. So there's a lot of interesting regional politics at play here, foreign investment opportunities. We can kind of get into this during the discussion, but this is a current status of damming in the Mekong Basin. Now we're going to focus a bit on China and just think about how China's dams are impacting Chiang Rai province and the area around where the elephants are that John Roberts cares, and we all care so much about. So this is a picture of the Xiaowan Dam. It's the second largest dam on the Mekong. This is a picture I took about 10 years ago, right after it went into operation. It's the third highest dam in the world, might be the fourth now because China just opened another big one yesterday. It could produce 4,200 megawatts of power. That's enough to power a large city. The country of Cambodia doesn't have that much power installed, 15 million people for a power sector of like 3,800 megawatts. And it can store a lot of water. It can store a quarter of the water in the Chesapeake Bay. There's a dam downstream, the Norjadu, which can store twice as much water as the Xiaowan Dam, and that's one of the largest dams in the world. And these two dams work together really in a concerted fashion to produce a lot of electricity, but change the natural flow of the Mekong. We've learned a lot about that over the last year. China does not share data about upstream dams with downstream countries. At least until late last year, when the most downstream dam at Jinghong, data around the operations of that dam began to come out on an hourly basis. So China did become more transparent. But for any of these other dams, there's no sharing of information about how they're operated. There's no sharing of information of when they start construction or when they finish construction or when they begin to produce electricity or where their power goes. Nothing. It's all a black box. And so it takes groups like ours to look at the satellite imagery and show everyone and show the world that these dams have indeed been completed, and now we're able to show how they're working. Just a quick overview of China's dams plan. China's not just damming the Mekong, but all the rivers of Southwest China, and it's part of a plan to exploit these really mighty, once wild rivers. So the Yangtze River, its major tributaries, the Pearl River, the Red River, which flows into Vietnam, the Mekong, are all part of the plan to first dam the lower stretches, the more easily accessed. But as you can see here with the orange dots are planned dams. The engineers are just moving farther and farther upstream to build more and more. And we hear that with this new 14th year plan, which just kicked off, there are plans to get started on finishing the dams on the upper portions of the Mekong. So those will be the dams that are in Tibet. So we should expect that to happen here over the next 5 or 6 years. Now, getting to the end of my talk and then to the Eyes on Earth study. What the Eyes on Earth team did, and this just kicked off a whole new era of transparency and understanding about the river. Again, they showed for the first time the extent, they showed when China's upstream dams were releasing or restricting water, for how long and to what extent. And they did this through using satellite data to develop a natural flow model that helps us imagine how the river would be running under natural conditions with all the rain and everything, the water that's in the basin, but without dams. And that's what you see here. You see this kind of predictable rise and fall. It's different every year because there's different levels of rainfall and such. And then overlaid that with Mekong River Commission gauge data. And Mekong River Commission gauge data at Chiang Saen and Chiang Rai province is going to show the impacts of dams upstream. But you don't know what the real impacts are until you overlay a model with it, right? So it's the difference between the blue line and the orange MRC gauge line that shows us when, for how long and to what degree. And interestingly, if you look at 2019, something happened. One, more water was released during the early months of 2019 than ever before. And then those reservoirs had to recharge as the downstream countries were going through drought. So previously, if you look at the orange line inside of the blue during the wet season, inside of those peaks, you see the orange line go up and up and up and up. But 2019 was unique because there was no Mekong pulse at all felt at Chiang Rai. But there would have been with the natural conditions. And that was the story that we broke. And that was the story of how the upstream dams exacerbated drought downstream. So this led to actually a lot of the need for explanation, because if you're imagining how a river would run using satellite data, you've got to explain how the satellite data works, right? And how confident you are in the model. So what my team had to do, again, we kind of understood what Eyes on Earth did, but a lot in the region didn't. We wanted to show how the reservoirs were being operated. And we had access to high resolution satellite imagery that would show on a daily basis what reservoir levels were. And we began to kind of string together little cartoons showing the reservoirs go up and down and charge during the wet season and restrict all that water. And then eventually we were demonstrating this to those who were concerned about the Eyes on Earth study, showing how that satellite imagery corroborated what the Eyes on Earth team found. And then through this process, we were plotting the satellite imagery on top of GIS processing tools, which allowed us to develop a method to use the satellite imagery to develop a level of the reservoir within plus or minus 1 meter of error. So over time, we came up with the idea, we all said to each other, to the Eyes on Earth team and my team, that we could do this. We could put together a near real-time reporting platform that on a weekly basis uses publicly available information to show what the river would be doing under natural conditions and also monitor 27 dams throughout the Mekong Basin, with a lot of focus on China's upstream dams. And we launched the platform on December 15th of last year. You can go into the platform and you can see reservoir changes yourself. You can look at the satellite imagery and use a comparative slider to see how the reservoirs are changing over time, how they're draining over, say, the dry season, or how they're filling up over their wet season. And also, we kind of stumbled on a process where we can watch China's data portal. And when we see things happen and change on China's data portal, we can look at the satellite imagery and show that those changes happen from dam operations. So we began to watch China's data. We found times where, say, the river dropped significantly over a short period of time and began to issue alerts to downstream countries, to communities, to people like John who need the river for his livelihood and for the elephant's livelihood. And what we're able to do now is watch these changes. And if China's upstream dams drop the level of the river suddenly or cause an increase in river level suddenly, we issue an alert to those important beneficiaries and give them about 48 hours time to prepare and adapt for the incoming change. It's not necessarily changing China's behavior, but at least now people have time to adapt. And this is another part of the big sea change that's happened over the last year in data transparency. And we issued 16 alerts over the last 6 months. We were really surprised at the number of times that those upstream dams changed the river level. And John and his team have been really critical, and I'm really grateful for his reporting, because he's kind of the first one to see the change happening there. And often we're able to understand the timing of the changes through the communication we have with John and his team and other community groups on the ground there in the Golden Triangle, like Niwat Roykal's group and Cheng Kong, to first test how long it takes for these changes to occur, and then build a model that helps us determine more accurate time periods for change. And this type of reporting is delivering higher levels of transparency that improves accountability. It's reducing risk to people living along the river, and it's really protecting lives and livelihoods. Already, again, like I said, we've issued more than 15 alerts. There have been over 50 media stories written about the Mekong Dam Monitor, and now journalists are taking our data that we published and putting it to use to make their own stories. And this happened actually on the last alert that we show here. That we sent the alert out to journalists, and the Bangkok Post reported on it, and the Thai government reported on it too. And we're also blown away by our social media engagements. There's been over 300,000 social media engagements since we've launched in December. So I think this is kind of a good place to end. There's still time to change the trajectory of damming in the Mekong. I don't think that we could change, future dams being built out in China, but perhaps there's a way to change how they're operated and how impacts downstream can be lessened and more natural flow can be moderated and modulated. But I think the downstream is a more malleable landscape. For a variety of reasons, damming is kind of slowing down now. We can talk about that more in the discussion. But it's being slowed down by solar, it's being slowed down by the coronavirus, and many other reasons. So there still might be time to keep the Mekong mighty. And it's going to require a lot more work. I hope that many of you, if you're not working on the Mekong, you can be inspired by the work of the Stimson Center and again, hundreds of other groups that have been working diligently on this issue to advocate for a brighter future for the Mekong. And if you have been working on this issue, kudos to you, and keep up the work. But let me end here, and happy to take some questions from everyone.
Okay, well, I know that Kun Apisom has arrived as well. So if you have any questions, Kun Apisom, please just unmute yourself and talk, or any comments. My first point is that it's also being slowed down by coal. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
Cambodia decided to kick those dams down the line and then build a coal-fired power plant in the national park that we're helping to supposedly protect. But that's so
Right.
these things have a momentum all of their own, and I think we can touch on that a little bit later about the power needs. My first question is going to be one of the arguments, or one of the things that we've been given over the years as to why this is happening is that some of the dam operators and or maybe even the Chinese government, and I'm not quite sure how interlinked and how much they communicate, is that they've been presenting this lack of pulse as a beneficial thing, that the river is too, my brain's stuck on elephants, but the river, their argument is the river gets too low in the dry season, so we release water then to allow you to continue to use the river, and then in the wet season it gets too high, and this prevention of flooding is they see the flooding as an entirely negative, and they see the dry sandbanks as entirely negative. So they see the pulse.
Right.
The argument they give, they see the pulse as a negative thing. And I have an engineering degree, and I remember physics lessons when I was a kid where they would show the wonders of the damming of the Colorado River and man conquering nature. So this isn't a Chinese mindset. This is possibly an engineering mindset. My question is there actually anybody downstream calling for this lack of flood, be they government, navigational, or anybody else? Is there actually any call for it, or is it just something in the engineers' minds that we need?
Well, I think, unfortunately, there are some downstream that see the benefits in hydrological regulation of the Mekong natural flow. Some of them might be for navigation, right? Raising the level during the dry season would allow for the passage of more boats. And then as more urbanization happens along the course of the Mekong, you have fewer people who are reliant on agricultural processes and fishing, and more people who live in concrete structures, and you can have flooding of streets and all this. So there's kind of a rising discourse for flood regulation and drought relief from upstream regulation. I think that the number of stakeholders that fight for that is a much smaller quantity than those who rely on the natural pulse. But there's a powerful set of stakeholders that could latch on to the upstream regulation argument, effectively joining the China camp or the engineering camp, as you rightfully recognized, and fight for more storage, fight for more upstream storage. And I think that's really, really, really dangerous for the Mekong. It's dangerous looking backwards. The Mekong River Commission has produced solid data showing that there is a magnitude higher level of benefits from floods than damages caused by floods. That's a magnitude, okay? And it's something like $60 billion are the benefits from floods. But looking forward, as we come into a more kind of climate averse type situation, taking resources away that are naturally provided to the most vulnerable peoples will only create more social ills and higher levels of security risk for these countries. So a goal should be to maintain livelihoods. It's not going to be possible in the face of climate change to build large cities and move entire rural populations into large cities in the Mekong, like China has. It's just not going to happen. So therefore, there needs to be a rectification of the argument for upstream regulation, as well as some newer engineering techniques brought to play. Climate engineering, green engineering, the look at green infrastructure, and the way that nature-based solutions can also drive economies and keep livelihoods going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. And that kind of plays into my second question. I think it was the Bangkok Post yesterday, but somewhere, oh no, it was Tyler Roney's, somebody anyway, about the beginning of construction. Yeah, the Luang Prabang Dam, where he said that it was without. I mean, and I know he gets it. Where the big plan is to sell. It was being built to sell electricity to Thailand, and yet the Thai government are currently complaining about it.
Right.
I mean, now there's an obvious disconnect in there,
Yeah.
and the same. Well, Sayabri is entirely, I think, providing money to Thailand, funded by Thai backers,
Right.
and yet downstream in Thailand, that's where the complaints. I think there has been an attempt at a class action, which hasn't done very much. And sitting in Thailand, I suppose I have to be a bit careful. But also, of course, there's the Pak Beng Dam, which I hopefully is that even is high enough up that the reservoir may actually increase water levels in Thailand. So, and all of these are being done to sell electricity back to Thailand. Could you give us some idea how? I mean, I think it's just government departments operating in silos is my guess, but can you give me a clearer idea of how this disconnect
Well, I just think that this the stalling of the construction of these 5 Mekong mainstream dams that have gone through the MRC notification and consultation process is indicative of, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, right? So these things were envisioned 20 years ago. The battery of Laos, the battery of Southeast Asia concept for Laos was envisioned 20 years ago. And I don't think anyone in Thailand or Vietnam, they agreed. They said this is a good idea because we're maxing out all of our power generation fuel choices. Coal is probably a bad idea for the future. Gas is limited. We're not going to do nuclear, so we got to move into what's available, and that was hydro across the border. But now with solar and wind and other forms of power generation coming online in ways that we had never predicted, it's just shaking up the system. And it provides space for, say, like Thailand's Office of National Water Resources, led by Dr. Songkap Pranjamwong, to kind of rail against the environmental impacts of these Thai-built Mekong dams in Laos that are supposed to send power back to Thailand. So that's I think that's one of the most interesting spaces to watch on how Thailand signals about buying power from these Mekong mainstream dams, which kind of look stranded. They don't have power purchase agreements, which means they don't have their financing shored up, because you can't get money from the bank if you don't have a power purchase agreement. That's like a basic fundamental need to move a dam forward. And there are 5 of them, the Luang Prabang Dam, Pak Beng included. So that's the thing to watch. They all kind of fit a common set of problems. But at the same time, Laos is kind of stuck with a lack of market for these things that it wants to sell. Laos is going to push to find markets, unless someone or some country or some policy option is there to provide an alternative for Laos. We're still going to see forward movement on these dams in various ways.
Yeah, they tend to have a momentum, and Thailand is not alone. I think Southeast Asia is not alone. That these there tend to be other reasons that construction goes ahead.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of momentum on that. And yes, we won't touch on that at this stage because it's a bit controversial. But some people mind building complete white elephants, if you like, and destroying it because some bits of money have gone places that they have already paid for someone's education. Anyway, enough of that.
Right.
Kun Apison, I see you've there we go. Please join the conversation.
Hi. Okay, thank you for a very wonderful presentation. Can you hear me well?
Can hear you well, Apison. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. My question is if you were advisor to the Lao government and dam is not the option, what would be a choice? What would be other choice? How Lao going to develop the economy?
Right. Yeah, I would look to emulate other landlocked kind of least developed countries and see the pathway that they took that they're taking, or look at other small countries that have an abundance of natural resources that didn't like destroy all of their rivers through hydropower damming and power sales to the neighborhood, but found other ways forward. So Costa Rica is an example, I think, that Lao can learn from. Again, it's not a apples to apples comparison, but everyone here on this side of the world knows that Costa Rica is a premier tourism destination, particularly for ecotourism. You would need 4 or 5 trips to Costa Rica to really feel like you saw the entire country and experienced the natural beauty and the resources of Costa Rica. And it's a small country. Laos has so much to offer in terms of tourism and a lot of untapped resources. At the same time, when, like for better for worse, Chiang Mai is becoming less attractive to tourists. When previously it was a major tourism destination. So Chiang Mai is kind of your negative teacher in this, what you don't want to turn into. Sorry for those folks living in Chiang Mai. I know it's a wonderful place to live. So I think that's an untapped resource, and tourism is and could be a much larger driver of economic development for Laos. But the problem is tourism, and I've been talking about this for a long time, is it's pro-poor, right? The money goes to the people first, and then the elite get their cut at the end. And in a country like Laos, mostly everything is top down, where the decision makers get their payoff first, and dams can do that for them, and the benefits trickle down more slowly to those farther down the hierarchy.
Yes, it's actually going to be very interesting since we're touching on tourism, and obviously I'm sort of a tourism professional in one of my day jobs.
Indeed.
Unfortunately, tourism, COVID has shown up the idea of tourism relying entirely on tourism for your for your conservation benefits and to keep everything green and nice. There's one small flaw that happens if tourism completely disappears for 2 years.
Right.
Which is as big a flaw as not being able to sell your electricity if you're actually truly doing it for the benefit of the country. But as you say,
right. Well, and if a pandemic also drops regional energy demand, everything goes to 0 or 10%. That impacts your income from hydropower production as well. So you can be equally vulnerable in that situation.
Exactly. But as you say, I alluded to, and you've said the top people have got their cut already. So that's not as big a thing. Okay, Kun Apisom has to go. Thank you very much, Kun Apisom, for joining. Are you still there? Do you have any questions from Facebook?
Yes, the question from Rennie is the century scale water availability X-tax in Southeast Asia prevalent for the sustainable of the dam operations?
Oh, that's a good question. So here we're thinking about water as fuel, right? Because after all, if your dam doesn't have the fuel needed to turn the turbines, then it can't do what it's supposed to do. I think a good example of this is the Lower Sason 2 dam, which went into operation in Cambodia, blocking those 2 tributaries that I talked about earlier. Went into operation in December 2018. And this was a dam that the Cambodian government promised was going to solve all the country's electricity needs, dropping prices in a big way. Cambodia used to be the home of the most expensive electricity prices in Asia. And again, solving all these needs. And in the first 6 months of its operation, there just wasn't enough water coming through the system to make that, to make good on the power that it was supposed to produce. And what we saw in early 2019 was 6 months of rolling urban blackouts in Phnom Penh. So that dam clearly didn't do what it's supposed to do. And I think this is kind of a harbinger for the future. That sent a signal to the Cambodian government that maybe large hydropower dams aren't part of our power generation future. And if the dry season, as predicted by climate change experts, is getting longer, that means less water is available for longer parts of the year. And the wet season is more intense, and it's all happening at the same time. So like all the turbines are spinning at the same time all across Southeast Asia. You have this massive amount of supply, and the prices go down at a time when demand might not be so high. So again, it's not the best. It's not the most ideal form of power generation for the Mekong from an economic an accounting perspective writ large, let alone the environmental impacts.
Okay, thank you. I still have another one from Rebecca.
Sure.
Describe Southeast Asia going for more clean and green energy. Can they make a difference with China building dams every few miles?
Yeah, definitely. I think China's impacts to the Mekong in China are essentially baked in. Nothing is going to change there. No new huge dams are going to come online that are going to really affect the amount of water that's restricted and released each year. There will be more dams, but again, the big ones, the big impact makers like Shaowan and Nuajadu are operating like they're supposed to do, and that's not going to change unless someone convinces the Chinese to operate their dams differently, which is still a future possibility. But the picture of hydropower development in the lower countries is much more complex. There are a lot more disruptives that can change the future, a lot less dependency on hydropower moving forward. So there's still time to promote alternatives, and there's still time to work with local governments on how to coordinate dam operations so you can do more with less and also reduce the impacts to hydrological flow. So now there's a situation in Laos where there's just too many dams. There's not enough power, not enough demand for the purchase of power from those dams. And that's going to take a while to work through. When you have that situation, no one is sitting there in the armchair beside you saying, build more dams, right? They've got a problem that they have to take care of. And I think the next 5 years we're going to see Laos working on taking care of that problem rather than promoting the building of more and more dams.
Okay, great. And then, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's finished. Thank you so much.
Okay, and then one final question, and I did say, I know you're not a fish ecologist. One final question that came up on the lockdown live stream this morning when I mentioned you would be on. I don't know if, actually I can't recall who asked it, is, are there any more giant Mekong catfish left?
I think so. There was a dead one that was pulled out of the river a couple months ago. So if there's one, there should be more. I think the people to talk to are the fishers. And then there's the Wonders of the Mekong program, which Seb Hogan, who's kind of, one of the leading Mekong giant catfish experts and the host of Nat Geo's Monsterfish. He tracks these and he would be able to provide a more definitive answer. So for that, watch the Wonders of the Mekong social media accounts. It's great stuff that they produce.
I do not currently do that, and I will do immediately after this. Thank you very much. And I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for that, Brian. Fantastic insight. Great to give a little bit more background. Of course, you and I have talked quite a lot about it, so great to be able to get some more detail and to get some accuracy on some of the broad statements that sometimes I make when I'm talking to people who listen. Yep, that's it. It's going to be very interesting this year. This is actually, I don't think I've told you this yet. This is the first time on my records that June has gone through 400 millimeters of rain here in the Golden Triangle. So by far the wettest, and I'll give you a percentage tomorrow when the final reckoning is done. One more storm tonight, and we might change things. But anyway, it's definitely going to be the wettest June on record. As far as I can remember, the first June where we've hit, and your wetness index probably has a technical term for this, where the ground is saturated. That tends to happen sometimes in August, where you just notice when it rains, it runs off. It doesn't soak in anymore. Tends to happen in August from my memory. I've never really recorded it, and I don't think it happened at all last year. As you said, big drought year. And now the ground is well and truly saturated. If we get rain, it just sits there or runs off. So going to be very interesting to see. Hopefully that will all flow down to, won't be stopped too much by Siabri Dam, and it will all flow down to Tonle Sap. And as you say, the effects in China, or the question earlier about is there any difference we can make? I think 5 or 6 or possibly more years ago when we were getting denials about the dams before you guys were operating, when we were getting denials from upstream about how they could affect. There were a lot of percentages being bandied about how much when the river leaves China, what percentage of the total water comes in. It's a comparatively low percentage, and as you say, the tributary dams make a big difference to that.
Yeah. So how close you are to China matters. So like your water is nearly all China water, right? And it's really important to stress that when you get farther downstream, we've actually found that at Stung Treng, China water can be up to 40%.
Right.
So that's way down there in Cambodia. So that's still significant. So it tells you what happens in China can impact Cambodia in a profound way.
Yes, so that's it. But then 60% of the water, hopefully there's still some hope that if we get a ton of rain up here, it'll grow something for Tonle Sap at least one more year. Okay, that's actually, that wasn't the depressing note I was hoping to end on, but it is what it is. Thank you very much, Brian. Fantastic talk. We will be in touch all the time. You're on Twitter. Can you give us your social media?
My Twitter is my Chinese last name, which is AI Kunming, as in the city I used to live in China. So it's I Kunming on Twitter. And then you can follow the Mekong Dam Monitor on Facebook. So search for that on Facebook, Mekong Dam Monitor.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. And yep, I don't think I have anything.
John.
Thank you very much. And
thanks, Wu. Take care over there.
Thank you. Hope to see you again.
Cheers.
And we will see the audience later, I think at 4 o'clock this afternoon for another lockdown live stream where I will have forgotten all the details. So I'll recommend everybody come back and watch this and go back to making my broad statements. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.